Chapter 89, Part 1. And one of those four went to one of the white bulls and taught him. And he built himself a vessel and dwelt in it. And 3 bulls dwelt with him on that vessel. And the vessel was covered and roofed over them. And I was watching, and behold, I saw 7 sluices pouring out much water onto the earth. And behold, chambers were opened in the interior of the earth, and waters began to bubble up and rise upon the earth. And I was watching until the earth was covered by the waters, and water and darkness and mist stood upon it. And all the bulls were sinking and engulfed and perishing in those waters. And the vessel was floating on the waters, but all the bulls and elephants and camels and donkeys sank in the waters to the bottom, together with every animal, so that I could no longer see them. And they were unable to escape, but perished and sank into the deep. And again, I watched in the vision until those sluices were closed from that high roof, and the fountains of the chambers were stopped up, and other abysses were opened. And the water began to descend into them until the waters vanished, and the earth was uncovered. And the vessel settled onto the earth, and darkness withdrew, and it became light. That white bull came out of that vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of those 3 bulls was white like that bull, and one of them was red like blood, and one of them was black. And that white bull departed from them. And they began to begat wild beasts and birds, so that every kind of species arose from them: lions, leopards, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, conies, pigs, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. But among them a white bull was born. And they began to bite and to chase one another. But that white bull which was born among them begot a wild donkey and a white bull with it. And the wild donkeys multiplied. But that white calf which was born from it begot a black wild boar and a white ram of the sheeps. And that wild boar begot many wild boars, and that ram begat 12 sheeps. And when those 12 sheeps had grown up, they handed over one of themselves to the wild donkeys, and those wild donkeys in turn handed that sheep over to the wolves, And that sheep grew up among the wolves. And the ram led forth all of the 11 sheep to dwell with it, and to pasture with it among the wolves. And they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to oppress the sheep until they did away with their young. And they cast their young into a great stream to sink them in the waters. Then those sheep began to cry out on account of their young, and to make complaint to their Lord. And a sheep which had been preserved from the wolves fled and went off to the wild donkeys. And I watched while the sheep lamented and cried out, until that Lord of the sheep descended from a lofty chamber at the voice of the sheep, and he came to them and saw them. And he summoned that sheep which had fled from the wolves, and he spoke to it about the wolves, that it should testify against them not to touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves at the command of the Lord. And another sheep met that sheep and went with it. And the two of them went and entered together into the assembly of those wolves. And they spoke to them and testified against them that they should not touch the sheep from this time forward. After this, I saw the wolves, how they dealt more harshly with the sheep with all their might, and how the sheep cried out. And their Lord came to the sheep and began to strike the wolves, and the wolves began to lament. But the sheep were quiet, and thereafter they did not cry out. And I watched the sheep until they went out from the wolves. And the eyes of the wolves were blinded. And the wolves went out in pursuit of those sheep with all their might. And the Lord of the sheep went with them, leading them, and all his sheep followed him. And his face was dazzling and glorious and fearsome to look upon. And the wolves began to pursue those sheep until they met them by a watery marsh. And that watery marsh was split apart, and before them the water stood to one side and on the other. And their Lord, as he led them, stood between them and the wolves. And while those wolves had not yet seen the sheep, they went into the midst of that watery marsh. And the wolves pursued the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into that watery marsh. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee from his presence. But that watery marsh flowed together and suddenly returned to its natural state. And the waters swelled up and rose until it covered those wolves. And I watched until all the wolves which had pursued those sheep perished, sinking and drowning, and the waters covered over them. But the sheep passed on from those waters, and they came to a desert, a place where there was no water or grass. And their eyes were opened, and they saw. And I watched until the Lord of the sheep was pasturing them, and giving them water to drink and grass to eat. And that sheep was going and leading them. And that sheep ascended to the summit of a high rock. And the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And they all stood at a distance. And after that, I saw the Lord of the sheep, who stood before the sheep. And his appearance was strong and great and fearsome. And all those sheep saw him and were afraid before him. And all of them were afraid and trembling because of him. And they, together with the other sheep which was in their midst, were crying out after that sheep who had ascended.
We are not able to stand before our Lord or look at him.
And again, that sheep which led them went up again for a second time to the summit of that rock. But the sheep began to go blind and to stray from the path which he had shown them. But the sheep did not know about these things. And the Lord of the sheep was filled with great wrath against them. And that sheep learned about it, and went down from the summit of that rock, and came to the sheep, and found most of them blinded and straying. And when they saw him, they were afraid, and trembled before him, and desired to return to their folds. And that sheep took other sheep with him, and came to the sheep. And they slaughtered everyone which had gone astray. And they began to fear before him. And that sheep brought back those sheep which had went astray to their folds. And when the straying sheep had returned to their folds, that sheep set about reproaching and slaying and punishing everyone who swore by. And I watched in this vision until that sheep was transformed and became a man, and built a house for the Lord of the sheep, and made all of the sheep stand in that house. And I watched until that sheep which had met that sheep which had led them fell asleep. And I watched until all the large sheep perished, and little ones arose in their place. And they came to a pasture and approached a river of water. And that sheep which had led them, which had become a man, was separated from them, and he fell asleep. And all of the sheep searched for him, and cried bitterly because of him. And I watched until they ceased crying for that sheep, and crossed that stream of water. And 2 sheep arose, which led them instead of those which had fallen asleep. And they led them. And I watched the sheep until they were entering a good place and a pleasant and glorious land. And I watched those sheep until they were satisfied, and that house was in their midst in the pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were opened, and sometimes they were blinded, until another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened.